days in the pop culture. The banjo has kind of found its way back, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. How the banjo used to be kind of front and center in the most popular American musical form of its time, and in a lot of different early popular American music forms. So that'll be fun to explore here. So, like I said, we'll give you a little bit of info. We're all practitioners, banjo lovers, and musicians, and so we're kind of part-time quasi banjo scholars. We're not bona fide academics.
Maybe, possibly.
But if we put, yeah, we're scholar adjacent, and banjo scholar is probably an oxymoron anyway. But we're gonna put our heads together and give you some information that hopefully will make you say a couple times tonight.
Putting our heads together.
Yeah, that is a pun. If you're in the banjo club, you get that pun. So anyway, I have some notes here that I can't read from here, so we'll keep it cash. Um, so the banjo. Before we get to early American music and the banjo, let's get to how the banjo got here. And the general understanding is that there were some proto banjo instruments that found their way eventually to colonial United States through that colonialization, of course. These proto banjo instruments, musicologists categorize them as spiked lutes, but they came from African communities, and so when these African communities were forcibly relocated into the Caribbean and what became the colonial United States, they brought with them a variety of quote unquote spiked lute instruments, which were generally a gourd or from carved wood with a skin stretched across it like a drum, with a stick through it and some string, probably some gut string. Um, and so you'd get something that would look this would still be advanced compared to what we're talking about right now, but something that look just like that, except just a straight stick probably going through instead of that fancy neck he's got up there. Yeah, it still goes straight through. So if you just imagine that the fret where his right hand is really just a little
like
stick,
dowel rod.
like a dowel rod. Yeah,
And it was round.
you get a good visual of what most of those early proto banjo instruments looked like. And another very distinct aspect of those is they tended to have a little shorter string on top to play drones. So in musical terms, a drone is just a little single note that you can access often. So a really common reference point there would be the bagpipes. You hear somebody play Amazing Grace on the bagpipes, you hear but underneath you hear that's the drone, right?
That's
on the
just
band.
the audience groaning.
Yeah. We're running. On a banjo or a banjo that has the little drum string on them, you hear it more just kind of happening. You hear that one string kind of just the same little note just kind of coming in and out, and that's called a drone. So that was an element of these early what are known as kind of proto banjo instruments. So, of course, with those instruments came the musical traditions of the folks that brought them, and so folks who are in colonial America, African Americans is a term we can use, right? The enslaved folk there brought their music and culture and these proto banjos with them, and eventually we end up with all sorts of banjo family instruments. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the design evolution of the banjo and how that kind of happened. But anybody wants to jump in at this point, feel free. But what we have then is a lot of documentation of these instruments, which were often called banzas and banjars and variations of those kind of words. which eventually became banjo for us. We have documentation of African Americans playing these banjo type instruments, and then eventually, that just becomes part of the culture. And eventually, of course, you have an intermingling of cultures. You have mainly colonial Anglo and European Americans and the African Americans, and all of a sudden there's exchange, obviously, of music and repertoire, and you can see how we get something like this or this today as time moves on and as these various elements of the two main cultures that were colliding there started kind of intermingling. We kind of end up with more modern day banjos. So the very first kind of well documented model, I guess, incarnation of a banjo going from more of a spiked lute idea to what we would call maybe an early modern banjo design would look, I'm going to say something like that, but maybe a whole lot like that, huh?
A whole lot like this. Yeah, this is made in replicating. This is how they were made in 1848. This is the design. This was the first commercial banjo. But I'd like to tack on to what he was talking about and maybe backtrack just a skosh and talk about, because the relevance of this topic is the banjo and its role in pop music. So we can't talk about pop and so trace that back to West Africa and we look at the role that this played musically. It was something to be sung with. So you didn't really see a lot of just string bands playing instrumental music. It was an accompaniment. So if you think of modern day Robert Johnson, the Lonesome Fella and his guitar, it really goes straight back to the Lonesome Fella and his Acante.
Yeah, and until probably the late 1890s in America, it would have been the Lonesome Fella and his banjo, his or maybe still an accounting. Accounting is one of those gored spiked lute instruments that you can see very well just by looking. You can see that it's definitely an ancestor of the modern day 5-string banjo. And even when you watch people play it in the traditional style, you see that it is the same as one of the traditional styles that we have today.
So, for example, what you'll hear a lot of is like a dialogue between the banjo and the singer. So you'll hear a lot more riff type of music as opposed to now we think of fiddle tunes, which have A parts and B parts and C parts and sometimes, and there's chord changes and everything. An example of a riff in its earliest form would maybe be something like, let's see. Which you can hear, it doesn't go many places. It just kind of hangs around. So it could be a conversation between, with some words, which we can demonstrate in a second. So that's kind of an interesting point because, the way that music came, you can kind of see how European music and that African tradition of the conversation really came into, and we'll talk about this more, but into ragtime and jazz, how you have interplay with all these instruments in a really exciting way. And not to say that classical music isn't exciting, but you didn't have to be schooled as it evolves. But anyways, so 1600s, 1700s, the banjo is pretty much a gourd instrument. Late 1700s into the 1800s, you start to see things like buckets being used, things that were already, or grain measurers. You could go down to the general store and you could buy various sizes of these oak single-rimmed, all that this is, grain measurers, and stretching, skins over that. You start to see the formation of the modern-day banjo and the advancements taking place. And then, was it Philadelphia? Is that where Boucher was, or was it Boston?
I don't know for sure.
The Northeast.
Yep, exactly.
There was a, we already had the drum, and this is essentially a drum with strings on it. So the
I think it's
advancement
Boston.
of the drum,
It's Boston.
Boston, yeah. The advancement of the drum had been coming along. So this was bound to happen, the advancement of the banjo, the ability to tighten the head on your own, or eventually to get into geared tuners. These were all things that came out of the advancement of the drum itself. So the first person, William Boucher, that advanced this banjo commercially, not the only person, but he was a drum manufacturer, so it was not far-fetched.
Yeah,
but,
just put a stick on that drum.
he just put a
Put
stick
some
on
strings
that drum.
on there.
Yeah. Really, he wasn't that clever, was he?
But in
People have been putting sticks on drums for a long time.
a lot of people like to point out too that the friction style pegs that the tuners use are straight out of the violin tradition.
Right.
So you can see a lot of the different influences.
This right here is a 5-string.
That's a 5-string.
The instrument that would have come over was a 3-string.
Yeah, and there are some various string variations, but usually 3 was the most common. Occasionally 4. 5 was 5. So he's talking about the point in the mid 1800s, I believe, when Boucher was one of the main pioneers there. Started kind of commercializing, setting up a commercial product, and that kind of started codifying some of the different design variations that were happening all over. And so all of a sudden, 5 strings starts becoming the norm right when people start, for lack of a better word, mass producing banjos in one particular way. Then it almost just kind of happened that way. I'm sure there were certain musicians too who started to think like, I could use an extra string on here,
Well,
but
then
it kind of
course,
settles in at that point to a 5-string model.
Then of course, as England always does, go over to England, you see 9-string banjos, 6-string banjos, way overdone. No.
Yeah, which was
No, just kidding.
which we'll get to playing some music here, but I'm going to jump in again and say so at this time too, probably it's the chicken or the egg thing, but whether Boucher was jumping in on the craze or was part of the reason the craze happened, but this was a time when minstrel music became the most popular entertainment genre in America at the time. And minstrel music was born of plantation music and was popularized and commercialized by white performers. This is where you get into the very problematic images and historical memories when you're looking at blackface performers and stuff like that, because it was the commercializers and popularizers of the minstrel music, which was social and community entertainment up to that point, probably more local and regional, were white performers who were kind of co-opting this stuff. But it makes for a really interesting part of our history, because it turns out that was still considered America's first national musical pop music. And it was all just like all of our pop music today. you could cynically say it was born from the commingling of African Americans and European Americans, but maybe commercialized by the European Americans grabbing it up and spreading it around and co-opting a little bit. That's another discussion.
Is anyone here familiar with
this
the
touches
records of Polk Miller? Has anyone heard Polk Miller? The guys on stage, I'm sure have.
Yes.
Polk Miller is an interesting character. He was the child of a white slave owner, and lived during slavery and during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, in fact, a long time after, in the early 1900s, he formed a band with several men who his family used to own, and it was him, a white, somewhat elderly man, and several ex-slaves, and they toured around the South. Polk refused to do blackface out of respect to his co-musicians, and ultimately quit touring because he was afraid for the safety of his bandmates, because the sight of a white man on stage with several black musicians was very controversial. Honestly, listening to the tunes as well, it does make you cringe a bit, because there's lots of that good old Southland stuff, and as well as a lot of other material. But it's an interesting band, and it's an interesting sound. The vocal work, by the African American performers who were vocalists. They didn't play instruments in the band. Is beautiful, and Polk's banjo playing is really an incredible insight into what banjo playing sounded like in perhaps the 1850s, because he was playing music. All of the music was harkening back to his childhood, which is another reason why he teamed up with folks he knew. Another interesting thing is it was one of Mark Twain's favorite recorded bands, Polk Miller. So if you haven't heard of Polk Miller, look him up. You can find his wax cylinder records on YouTube.
That's a great reference.
Yeah, and at the end, maybe we'll list a few. If anybody's interested, we can give you a big list of artists you might want to check out that we touch on.
I'd just like to address one more topic in that era, and then maybe Brian and I can demonstrate a little bit of a thing. But another comment on it's a complicated history when you talk about the banjo, because you're talking about American history, which is black history, which is white history, which is, and what we're still figuring out today. But to give you an idea of how dark the history can get and how complicated it is, the first instructional tutor for the banjo was called Banjo Without Your Master, which is, and this is like this is pre the Civil War. So this is like, you can even see in publication the selling of a culture that's existing, and that culture not getting, any of that money, any of that royalties. So it's a really dark part of it, and there's not really any light on it other than that. Because of that publication, everyone around the country at that time was able to hear this and be influenced by it. And that influence caused, a change which happened. You get one publication happening, and that changes, things almost overnight. Because at that time, being able to order a piece of sheet music was like seeing something on the TV. So you'd hear people talk about how the Beatles changed music, in '64 or whatever. This was like that equivalent. So there is the influence that happens without anybody even meeting anybody. And while it's a dark part of our history, you can already start to see the impact that music can have on people.
Nick, what's that book you're referring to, the one that you built your banjo from?
Yes. Oh, yes. They used to, back then, another kind of insight into life back then is woodworking was considered more of a household skill. You could play the piano, you could milk a cow, you could know basic woodworking. And
Nick Steele is an example of that.
And in this instructional were plans on how to make your banjo. So you would buy the book, and then you would build your banjo, and then you'd learn how to play it. And if you can buy these, they still have it printed. It's not called that anymore. It's called like Minstrel Banjo, and it's early history. But you can still buy reprints of these, and you can read the way that they instructed this, and it really makes you question every piece of technology in the instruction manual that comes with it these days. That doesn't make any sense, because they were able to tell you how to build a banjo in 1848, and they can't even tell you how to turn on a TV these days.
Yeah, because really until about the mid-1800s, pretty much anybody who played a banjo built it themselves, or somebody in their family or community built it because they weren't being mass-produced. But they were in the 1850s, and again, chicken or the egg, because the minstrel music craze. Everybody all of a sudden wanted to play the banjo, so all of a sudden, everybody wanted to play the banjo. It became nice, fancy banjos became status symbols in Victorian households, and women played the banjo in the parlor. The banjo was kind of a genteel instrument in the Northeast, and it was a status symbol, and like I said, it'd be like parlor music. So that whole craze did kind of kick out. That was like the first pop music was banjo based. Minstrel music, by the way, is usually, historically banjo, bones, tambourine,
and fiddle.
Yeah. So let's play you some of this, and then we'll start playing some other genres of
so let's
early
do
American.
Ryan on the far end. Let's do Boatman. So this is a tune that comes from the same year that this banjo was mass produced. It's called the Boatman Dance.
Fiddle that with you?
You know it out of D?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll play this authentic Civil War era drum
trap kit. And so what I played before was an example of more of a riff-based, you know, you could interact with it with your vocals and whatnot. What you're going to hear from us now is a 3-part tune. This is, you can hear the evolution of folk music. This has parts, it's got words. Maybe we'll sing a verse.
Yeah.
And we'll just get into it. Are we in tune? I can also tune.
No,
It's hard to tell at this point which is harder
I'll
to
just
tune,
kind of
the
pluck
fiddle.
along, and if I think I have it, I'll get louder with you.
Okay, this is called the Boatman Dance. Hi-ho, the boatman roll, floating down the river, the Ohio. Hi-ho, the boatman roll, floating down the river, the Ohio. The boatman dance, the boatman sing, the boatman up to anything. And when the boatman gets on shore, spends his cash and he works for more. And the boatman dance, dance, boatman dance. You dance all night till the broad daylight, home with the gals in the morning. One more. Hi-ho, the boatman roll, floating down the river, the Ohio. Hi-ho, the boatman roll, floating down the river, the Ohio. The boatman dance, the boatman sing, the boatman up to anything. And when he gets on shore, he spends his cash, man, he works for more. And the boatman dance, dance, boatman dance. You dance all night till the broad daylight, home with the guys in the morning.
I love the depth. I love the depth that you get out of that instrument.
Yeah,
the
and I was
minstrel
just-
banjo is such a pure, deep sound, isn't it?
It really is. And,
It's
it,
like
and
water drops or something. It's beautiful.
yeah, it's got
Probably surprising to people who first discovered the banjo through the Beverly Hillbillies and Earl Scruggs and stuff like that to hear
yes.
that deep,
I
heavy.
often get asked, you know, what is this? Well, this is the banjo. And then I pull this out, and they say, well, no, that's a banjo. And I tell them, well, trust me, they're both banjos.
Yeah.
But one more comment before we move on. And as you look at old-time architecture, this is one other thing. It all kind of ties in. I'm sure you'll hear all of us talk on slight off tangents. But you're also talking about pre-electric, you know, at all. So pre-amplification. So the cool thing about this is actually a really loud instrument, and if you heat up the head, which this is a head made of calf skin, it gets really tight and it gets really loud. And there were auditoriums, you know, of a few hundred people, 500-person auditoriums, no microphones, and you could hear this thing clear to the back of the wall. You could obviously hear the bones, but it's also an interesting thing we'll talk about. The projection of the banjo is what literally, no pun intended, but actually intended, but projected the banjo into the future was its volume. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, let's play some more music.
You want to do that?
Even though I could keep talking.
What do you want to demonstrate?
Oh, while we're still that was a great demonstration of minstrel music, and and very accurate representation. I think we can at the same time. Nick mentioned Banjo Tutors, which are banjo instructional books, the original one. So at the same time, we had this big craze happening. That craze got imported back to England as well. There was always a give and take in early America, of course, well, even to this day, between American pop culture and Britain. And so in that whole thing, there were certain folks who started writing Banjo Tutors. Frank Converse wrote the
Frank
one we
B.
mentioned
Converse.
already.
Yeah.
And there were a few other folks, and all of a sudden, as part of this national craze, you had all this literature on the banjo, and then you started having classic banjo style, is what most people refer to this now, and that's the best way I can describe it is suddenly the approach to playing, the way Nick was just playing there, was a downstroke approach called stroke style that goes all the way back to the pre-banjo instrument African conting styles. The classic banjo, we're now playing it like some people called it guitar style at the time because we're plucking like a European guitar player would do. And then the genres there, even there's a lot of crossover, but also a lot more popular music, and it's definitely a different feel, more parlor stuff. And there's a lot of virtuoso classic banjo players. Nick, can you play us a virtuoso classic? I think we're actually both going to play. I'm going to play a snippet of one after Nick plays you.
Mine will not be virtuosic.
Mine either.
All right, it's a little out of tune, so that's good. So this is straight out of one of those tutors, and this is more or less an exercise. You hear, I don't know if you hear classical music and you hear, this is the Bach cello suite. Essentially, he was just running fancy ways of running scales. So this is essentially an exercise, but it's quite musical.
And just along those same lines, I'm going to play just a quick little run through of Spanish Fandango, which was one of the early published pieces that gained a lot of popularity. I think mostly because it was really accessible. And it was basically kind of the same thing. It was almost like an exercise. It's one of the first things I learned on the banjo because I'd heard a recording of a woman named Elizabeth Cotton playing it. And I thought, oh, that sounds doable. I bet I could play that. And then later I found out, like, oh, this is kind of the first song that most people would learn in their parlor in the late 1800s with their fancy banjo and their sheet music. So I'll give you a little piece of that. And then we'll start talking about
Maybe put the mic down.
Some other early 1900s stuff.
That's a good example of folk music working backwards. You'll hear Mississippi John Hurt play that and everything. And
Yeah.
TJ will have more examples of this. But usually, if you think about the evolution of music, you think, okay, well, finally they put folk music into music notation. But that's a piece that survived, and it was first notated and became, part of the folk tradition orally.
Yep.
Passed along.
The snake eats its own tail eventually. So that kind of gets us into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that's when we have all sorts of explosions of popular genres of music. Pretty much all of them have the banjo, if not front and center, pretty prominent in the mix. And you want to talk about some of these other styles, TJ, that you might know a little more about?
When do you guys want to do clawhammer? Do you want to do
think.
We can go back to
I
that
think
later.
after.
Let's
We'll
yeah.
go back to it.
Well, I mean, we can right now.
I want to make sure we
It's
have
hard to
time to hit
determine
some of these other ideas.
Okay, well,
Good. Go
I've got a fair bit to say about the 1920s as usual.
Yeah.
But if you would like to talk about any four-string stuff before if you want to cover the early four-string.
Oh, that's a good
before
call.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah,
we'll
let's
do
do
that. So yeah, four-string banjo gets introduced commercially again somewhere in the early 1900s. I haven't been able to figure out exactly what year, but it's somewhere early 1900s. And yeah, introduced kind of as a way for people who were used to playing mandolin to be able to approach a banjo in this scale length. TJ
We
can
got
talk
rid of
more
the
about
little string.
Yeah, got rid of the drone string, and TJ could talk more about the longer scale length. But yeah, I mean, a lot of single string playing rather than chorded playing with this scale length. A lot of tremolo, just like a. Just that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what these were for.
I hate you for your tremolo, Ryan. I so do. Ryan's got like one of the most natural tremolos ever.
does
The rest of
have-
us slave.
When you're
over
as
it.
shaky as I
They
am.
sound good.
He does have good tremolo.
It's so
It's just
annoying.
because he's really nervous.
Yeah.
All the time.
He just hasn't had a cigarette in a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, eventually this would be used with Irish music too. But what is regarded as Irish tuning today dates more to the 50s and 60s rather than what was originally used with Irish music. Because Barney from the Dubliners started tuning his banjo to an octave below a mandolin so that he could follow a fiddle even easier. But yeah, I'll do you part of one of theirs, but I don't have it in his tune. $1841, I put my corduroy breeches on. I put my corduroy breeches on to go working on the railway, the railway. I grow weary of the railway, for Patty works on the railway. I was wearing corduroy breeches, digging ditches, throwing switches, dodging hitches. I was working on the railway.
Yeah.
That's kind of Irish stuff there.
Let's say that's an Irish American song, then I imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, the melodies go back apparently to both.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of things that have a very similar melody.
Right.
But yeah, came around day of the railroad.
Excellent.
When banjos are also coincidentally getting around a whole lot more than they used to.
That's true. Banjos and railroad trains, there's no small Venn
Oh.
diagram crossover of people
That-
who are into both of those things.
That is a perfect banjo reference. The dinging bell of a train crossing gate is known as the Banjo Signal because
didn't know
it
this.
looks like this going back and
Oh,
forth.
yeah.
It's not a signal for the local wives to toss the husband's banjos onto the tracks.
Oh, it's that time again.
Unfortunately, most of those banjos don't make it onto the rails.
Yeah, it's more of a banjo alert.
Well,
Run.
banjo's like a grenade. Once you heard it, it's too late.
Oh, yes. I guess we could just tell banjo jokes for another 20 minutes and call it a day, but maybe we'll do that at the end. You want to talk
Yeah,
about some of
do
the
some-
stuff that you
absolutely.
know so much about?
So Ryan sort of mentioned how we start to see four-string banjos in America and worldwide. You start to see ragtime appear as a popular genre in the late 1800s and throughout the 19-teens, and there's even rags being composed in the 1920s. Throughout the 19-teens, you're still seeing lots of five-string banjo being used in ragtime, fingerstyle rag performers such as Wes Osman and Fred Van Epps were very prominent in the ragtime world. Um, their recordings are remarkable. Now this is still in the age of acoustic recording, so they must have been, you have these great big recording horns rather than microphones, and the banjo players would be playing right up against the horn with a whole orchestra behind them. So it's deceiving because it makes it sound like the banjo is actually equally as loud as a 20-piece orchestra.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's all about the placement of the banjo, I think, against the horn.
Yeah.
Not to say that these weren't very commanding banjo players. But then as jazz starts to become a popular form of American music and ragtime evolves into jazz music, you start to see a switch from guitars being used in small ensembles to banjos, largely because you are finding that the string instruments had to compete more and more with a louder, brasher, more wild sound. In early New Orleans music, guitar was the popular accompanying chord instrument along with the piano, but that did change to the banjo in the late 19 teens. I have a Plectrum Banjo here. The Plectrum Banjo is more directly related to the 5-string banjo than the tenor banjo. It's the same scale length.
Yep.
I've got the same amount of frets, I think.
And here's another interesting connection. The tuning that is used on these plectrum banjos comes from the tuning on the minstrel banjo. The minstrel banjo has that really low tuning. When in the 1880s, they raised it up a fourth, and this is the same tuning, just dropping the fifth. So that's an important connection because the tuning of the banjo is very relevant in the style that it's used.
Thank you. Yeah. So we call this a plectrum banjo. A plectrum. A plectrum is the old-timey or the European term for a pick, a guitar pick. So it's really showing the difference now that we've moved into this strumming technique. Some people believe that tenor banjos were more popular in orchestras and jazz ensembles because they had a bigger, brighter sound, and perhaps plectrums were more popular in small group stuff because of their deeper tonal qualities. I don't believe this myself. I've done a lot of looking into what the different orchestras were using, and seen lots of video evidence from the 1920s, film evidence, and I see both quite a lot. I do the tenor banjo has a very bright sound, but the plectrum banjo too can also be played in a very bright way. Too bright, you might say. No. So in the 1920s, you're seeing plectrum banjos and tenor banjos, and I think used in almost equal measure. When the Dixieland era comes in, that's traditional jazz revival, I get the impression tenor banjos were a little more popular than the plectrums. However, in the banjo band world, in the banjo club world, which, believe it or not, was separate to the traditional jazz revival of the 1940s, you see a lot of plectrum banjos. I'll talk a bit about why that is in a second. But moving on to talking about the plectrum style of playing, the pick style of playing, Ryan Koenig demonstrated a little bit of that single string method where you're using a tremolo. The tremolo is just where you move the pick up and down as quickly as you can to try and get the sustain, because that's the most sustain I can get without it. Whereas with it, I can play a melody and I can sweep over the sound of the orchestra and really be heard. You know, you can hear me nice and clearly, and that's a single string method. And single string playing was what you hear a lot in the 19-teens and mid-1920s. Throughout the 1920s, certain banjo players developed a technique they called the chord melody style of playing. Let me try and pick a tune here. There's a tune, Chinatown, My Chinatown. If I was playing it single string, that'd be single string. I could put a tremolo in if I wanted to. Certain banjo players found that if they wanted to really sustain the rhythm of the group and also provide a fuller sound, perhaps. They could do this method called chord melody. This is where you have your chord. So the chords for the same part of a tune I just played would be this. 1 chord to a 5 chord, back to a 1 for any musicians in the audience. And then what these banjo players did is they added the chord in behind the melody. Every note of the melody has a chord behind it. There's my tremolo again. And you can see how that's a really full sound. I almost don't need the whole group behind me. You can create a very
Good, 'cause
full.
they don't want to play with
Yeah, you know what I'm playing like that. Yeah.
And you only have to pay one banjo player for 2 banjo parts.
Yeah. And so chord melody became quite a popular technique, and listen out for it in 1920s records. You'll probably start to notice that you hear the banjo players either playing single string, or you'll hear them doing this other style. You'll hear them doing all that sort of wild syncopated stuff with chords. And lots of players will do a variation of the two. But I just wanted to give you something that you could listen out for when you listen to these old jazz records, that you could listen out for the banjos doing.
Do you have that example of the tremolo and the chord behind it? Or am I throwing you
I
under
was going
the
to get
bus?
to that.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
So this is talking about just talking about the ensembles. Just to give you a bit of background, in town here in St. Louis, I lead a group called the Arcadia Dance Orchestra. It's a authentic 11-piece 1920s style orchestra where we use all the original sheet music from the 1920s, and we do a lot of St. Louis material from the 20s as well. Through doing that group, I've really learned. I don't play banjo in that group. I play trumpet, but I'm always bullying my banjo player about playing louder, getting heavier strings, because it's all about projection, and that really influenced the way people played back then. You had to have big, heavy strings. You had to project. You had to have a big sound, like Ryan demonstrated, because you had to be heard over 10 other players, all with louder instruments than you, technically, if you didn't push. So that's as much as I'm going to go into in terms of ensemble playing. If there's any questions about 1920s jazz banjo, but anything any more in depth anyone would like to know, feel free to ask at the end. I think we'll have time for questions at the end. Nick asked me to talk real quick about the vaudevillians. Of course, banjo was really popular, as much as it was popular in the pop and the jazz music of the 1920s. It was incredibly popular in the vaudeville circuit, and lots of the stars of the vaudeville circuit were still around in the 1950s and 60s. You might remember Eddie Peabody. Anyone here know the name Eddie Peabody? He was a vaudevillian of the 1920s who was still performing on shows like the Lawrence Welk Show well into the 1960s. And he had this, he was just delightful. He was one of the guys who really pushed the chord melody style forwards. He would take a tune, let me think, like The World is Waiting on the Sunrise. He'll go. And he would like bounce his leg like that whilst he played. He would flip his banjo. He would do this one Eddie Peabody thing I often steal is that when he would get to the end of a song, he did lots of what I call the whip bongs, where you go whip bong like that. You'll get to a break. You do that. and so that's one vaudevillian trick I picked up. If I'm playing, I'll go back to Chinatown. If I'm doing Chinatown, this is a trick for any musicians in the audience. My lowest string is a C. I know that's my open string, and that's the key of the song, which means that I can do a stupid trick at the end of a song with it. I can go, let's see. I can just flip my banjo out like that, and thank you. and that's an old Eddie Peabody technique. I'm going to wrap it up real quick here. Another vaudevillian was Perry Brechtill. Perry Brechtill, and he had he had a trick he called the two-banjo trick, which Eddie Peabody also worked on. I'm not as good at it as I used to be, but I would like to tell you about it very briefly. He would have a shtick where he would say, well, the Vega Banjo Company are employing me and my band to be here. There were supposed to be 3 of us, but, well, Bob got the flu, and Jim, well, his wife wouldn't let him out the house. Now, Vega will only pay us if all 3 of us play. So I guess I'll have to do all 3 parts. And that's how he'd set up the routine. And first of all, he would say, well, there's the melody. And there's the bass line. And there's the chords. And then he'll do all 3 at once. Now, I haven't practiced this in a long time, but I think I can show you the gist of it. You'll have to go online for a better demonstration. But
That's awesome.
yeah.
Another important vaudeville thing that I want to make a note of that I kind of just thought of right now. That's where the 4-string banjo and really the banjo becomes associated with popular country music, because bands like Otto Gray's Oklahoma Cowboys, which were the first filmed country band, and they were popular in the vaudeville circuit doing kind of cowboy country and shooting tricks and roping tricks. But yeah, they had a 4-string banjo player.
Do you have any shooting tricks tonight?
No.
Lasso?
No.
Well, it should be said, too, that vaudeville grew right out of the minstrel scene. And I did mention earlier that the minstrel show would have the vaudeville show would have. It had music, comedians, and usually a big combination, a lot of people who did both and just various talent. And it would often incorporate musicians doing little tricks and stuff, like TJ was showing you there. And that lasted into the vaudeville era. And funny enough, I saw a lot of that on Hee Haw, speaking of country stuff. And Hee Haw, if you think about it, is kind of a modern day country vaudeville or minstrel format to the show. Music, comedy, variety, yeah, exactly.
The other
Did
thing
you,
I wanted to say about the just 20s banjo in jazz is, especially with the guitar being the popular instrument in New Orleans bands, I mean, that's really the perfect segue. That's also when the 6-string banjo really comes to prominence. Yeah, which is pretty much just guitar tuning on a banjo, used by Johnny St. Cyr and a couple other people to play jazz on, because you can go play way up the neck and have a brighter tone, but was also used by blues players because you can finger pick and get the low end too.
Yeah.
Papa Charlie Jackson, he was the big
Yeah.
guy, wasn't
Yeah.
he, for the 6-string blues banjo.
Yep. Django Reinhardt, that was his first
He started on
instrument, but we're talking about early American music.
Yeah.
Did you still want to play a full version of Chinatown, or should we just?
I'm a bit
we're
worried.
running a little low on time.
Yeah,
we might
yeah.
want to play.
Maybe if we get to the end, I can do some.
Yeah.
more.
So maybe we'll throw us all together and get a whole bunch of banjos going at once.
Yeah.
Sure.
Does that
Or
sound
did
good?
Ryan, did you have one on there you wanted to demonstrate?
Oh yeah, I guess I could do the
Yeah, yeah.
blues
Yeah,
real
yeah,
quick. Yeah.
We are at the
Actually,
Blues
let's talk
Museum.
about this. Let's have a thing real quick when I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because otherwise somebody will ask
Okay,
me about it.
yeah.
Yeah.
We can
let's
talk about it
Be
together.
quick. Hallelujah, hallelujah, I belong to the band, hallelujah, 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 I belong to the band, hallelujah. What kind of band are you talking about? It was that Holy Union band, I belong to the band, hallelujah, oh hallelujah, hallelujah, I belong to the band, hallelujah.
Yeah. you said you had something you want to
Oh
throw?
yeah, I'm not going to talk about this very much, but this is a curious instrument from the late 1920s. Recorded microphones meant that the guitars could come back into the popular music once again. They could be heard with new technology. So there was a lot of banjo players out there that needed to be convinced to buy new guitars. So the National Guitar Company created these 4-string resonator guitars with banjo necks, almost as an advertising tool to try and convince all of the dance orchestra and dance band banjo players to invest real money in new 6-string guitars. But they could be used very effectively as a swing instrument. And so there you go.
Yeah.
So this is a Plectrum national guitar.
This is also relevant in the decay of the banjo in popular music because these were designed by the Dopura brothers, which is where you get the name dobro. There was a medicine show, a guy that ran a medicine show that came to these two brothers to invent a louder guitar because the African-American performers in his band or in his show were getting tired of all the connotations associated with the banjo. So it shows the decay of the banjo in popular music and the evolution of this, which we think of typically in blues music. But if you want to learn more about this, next Sunday, not this upcoming Sunday, I'll be at the Science Center from noon to 4 talking just about national guitars. So we won't do that now. But
Nice.
okay, that'd be great.
I think in the remaining time we'll try to play some of these songs that we talked about playing all together.
Okay.
Because this isn't going to be exact representation of the banjo club kind of craze, but there were a lot of folks who would get together and just play all banjo style instruments.
What do you want to
And,
do?
Let's see. We had a few we wanted to try. Jackson Stomp, maybe.
Oh
be a
yeah,
good place
let's
to
do
start.
that.
I'll usually get you on that.
B flat.
And speaking of weird banjo things, this is just a banjo with a mandolin neck on it, which is pretty much made to get mandolin players playing banjos.
Who have we not gotten? The mandolinists.
There's more of them.
All right, B flat. Okay, we're gonna play a tune called Jackson Stomp. It's actually a piano piece that string players stole and renamed, but it was initially called the Cow Cow Blues. Yeah,
Ryan's got to grab something.
at a B flat. Are you sure? Yeah. We'll wait for you. You guys want to do a short one after the 4? Got that?
Short one after what?
The 4.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
The 11 bar.
The 11 bar. AABB. AABB, boys. 2, 3, 4. Our wives love it when we practice.
More banjo.
More banjo.
What else did we talk about? Oh, we talked about So one type of music that was played a lot in early minstrel music, and even before the kind of coalescing of something that could be called minstrel music, was a lot of Scotch-Irish tunes that came over and immediately got mangled up and blended into American melting pot kind of style. We were playing that Liberty when we got together, which is a square dance tune basically. But we were doing it with a bunch of banjos, so let's do that again. That'd be fun. We'll do that for you. We'll squeeze in. I told you in the beginning we were going to do more musicking than talking, but
See where that got us.
yeah. Turns out the only thing that gets any of us talking is nerdy things, nerdy banjo talk. Then you can't shut us up. We'll try to squeeze in a couple more if they'll let us. Who's kicking that?
Indeed.
Out of D?
Yeah.
Okay.
All good?
Yeah, buddy.
1, 2, 3, boom.
You really cooked it on that one, Ryan.
What else did we have on?
Germany.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah. So since we're at the National Blues Museum, we could maybe wrap it up with that, since I think we need to wrap the stuff up. But there's a lot we didn't get to talk about, but we'll just play you one more.
Yeah.
This is
What were you playing on this?
I'm gonna do "Going to Germany." I'm gonna play the 5-string on this. What do you want? You want to get
Yeah,
Jeff?
do this guy.
And this is one that was recorded, I think, written by Gus Cannon, who had a jug band who recorded out of Memphis in the late 20s and early to mid 30s.
Do we want to still do questions after this one, or
If
leave the
they're not
mystery?
kicking us out of here, we can do some questions and answers. Is that what you're
are
asking?
you guys closing up? Yeah.
But we'll do a little kind of country bluesy number.
What's your key?
G.
G for banjo.
I was way down there. I'm going to Germany. I'll be back some old day. I'm going to Germany. I'll be back some old day. I'm going to Germany. I'll be back some old day. Please tell me, Mama, what more can I do? Please tell me, Mama, what more can I do? All I know is I can't get along with you. thank you all. Thanks to the National Blues Museum, and thanks for y'all for coming out. That was fun. And if unless they need to clear us off the stage, well, if
We
anybody
can
does
do.
have any,
We have time for
questions?
2 questions from
Oh,
the
cool.
audience.
Let's
If
do that.
anybody would like to ask a question, raise your hand. I can bring the microphone over.
Ha,
No questions?
we've done our job well.
Okay, here we go.
I've always thought more of guitars with blues music than banjo. So are you saying that the guitar evolved from the banjo, or was it 2 separate instruments that culture made the guitar
yeah, they're definitely
more
two
popular?
separate instruments, but they did converge in the States, among other places. And most of the early blues players, because blues was developed in the same timeline that we're talking about minstrel music in the same circumstances. And so a lot of those players were doing like the call and response kind of stuff that Nick was talking about on banjos and available instruments. And guitars became, again, when they started being mass produced and sold in catalogs in the late 1800s, all of a sudden you could get a cheap guitar even on a small income. And so at that point, that's when the guitar kind of started pushing out banjo as the preferred instrument for a lot of folks who were playing blues music.
And another distinction I think may be important to make is to perhaps think about the blues separate from instruments, because the blues exists without, you can play it on whatever instrument. And it became popularized on the guitar, through various forms. One that happened recently was Eric Clapton did a record on Robert Johnson. And if you talk to us, Robert Johnson is like way new, but
It's
he
like
was
the Justin Bieber.
exactly.
No,
He's
no,
the
no,
Justin.
no, no.
But anyways, and it,
Not at all.
if there was one thing that I
We're a
think would be
fringe case
important to
then.
get away from this talk would be that all the musics that we talked about, while inspired by the instrument, once they've been created, are now separate from the instruments. So the blues is the blues without a guitar or without a banjo. It's it's just kind of its own.
And
It's an emotion.
yeah, I'm really glad you said that, and especially here in St. Louis. I think if you went back to the 1920s in St. Louis and talked about blues, the musicians people would mention wouldn't be the lone guitar player image. People would be talking about piano players, really. But St.
Yeah.
Louis is a big piano blues town, and people probably associated that more closely with the blues than anything to do with the singer-songwriter sort of blues thing. But also horn players. Charles Kreff was a St. Louis horn player, and he was considered nationally to be one of the greatest blues musicians, not just blues trumpet players, nationally one of the greatest blues musicians. So yeah, there are banjo players out there as well who are considered great blues banjo players. So I think you said it best, Nick. But I just wanted to name drop some St. Louis
I
people.
think that's wise. Thank you for the question, though. That's a
Yeah.
great question.
Does anybody else have a question they would like to ask?
We'll make up an answer.
Okay, here we go. This will be our final question.
Are these instruments all tuned the same, and are any of them tuned in fifths like a violin?
Yeah.
Yes. So to the first question, no. To the second question, yes.
Mandolin is the exact same as a violin, except with courses of strings, so 2 strings at once.
Yeah,
But-
so this is like a mandolin banjo, a mando banjo. Yeah, so that's tuned. Well, exactly is the wrong adjective, but yeah, just like a fiddle.
Yeah,
Or
I mean
violin.
it's still EADG from high to low.
And also the tenor banjo
Yeah.
that Ryan played earlier is also tuned in fifths.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this is tuned like a guitar, so
Exactly
a
like
lot
a
of
guitar.
fourths and a third. This is an open tuning.
Which means that it's tuned
open
to a chord.
G, which
yeah.
is what a lot of blues guitar players would use.
Ben, this tuning here is a lot like the open. These strings are the same, but I got a C. My low strings are C. We call it C standard. Plectrum tuning.
If you really get into it, that's standard tuning
Mm.
on the banjo, on the 5-string banjo, and then what is now considered standard tuning is raised bass tuning. But
Yeah,
which
this,
what you're
this
in now.
open G now is considered standard, but this is the older tuning, and this
And
is
this
the same
is
on
tuned
both
just
of
the
those.
same as that, but a good bit lower, but
Yeah.
same shape. So there's the long answer.
Right.
Thank
Yeah,
you all.
thanks.
Thank you.
All right. So once again, a very special thank you to Ryan Koenig, Ryan Spearman, TJ Miller, and Nick Pence. I hope you enjoyed this program. Yeah, let's hear it for them. I really hope you enjoyed this program. I hope you were entertained. I hope you learned something. Programs like this are made possible by people just like you, our members, our donors, our visitors. So if you haven't considered it, we strongly urge you to consider becoming a member of the National Blues Museum. As a member, you'll get exclusive access to members-only events. You get discounts in the museum gift shop. You get discounts on concert tickets, as well as free admission to the museum. And you also play a role in supporting programming just like this that we are continuing to offer free because of that support. So other than that, I do want to say thank you once again for joining us tonight. Thank you for everyone that's viewing through Live Living Network and everyone that watched on Facebook. But other than that, I hope you all have a great evening, and thanks again for joining us.